Welcome back to Andersen Acres. We're here with Shadowfax again, who's definitely been rolling in the boogers. Look at that. You can tell he's been rolling, and now he's eating his hay. And today I wanted to talk about shelter for your mini horses. So your mini horse does need shelter. They do really well outdoors in all weather. However, they still need shelter. You're okay, scratching your head on her. All right. So they still need shelter. They need protection from the rain, the wind, the snow, the sun. They do need to be able to get out of the sun. So it's really important that there be some kind of shelter, even though your mini horse can be out in pretty much all weather, because they do fantastic outdoors in pretty much all the different weather. They're fine in a snowstorm, they're fine in the warm, they're fine. But they still need shelter. You can't just not give them any kind of shelter. That's not the way this works. They have to have something. Okay? Some climates you can get away with just having an awful lot of trees and brush so that they can hide from the weather. That's not true in most climates. In most climates, you're going to need some kind of shelter. Now, you have a lot of different options for shelter. The cheapest and easiest to build is a three-sided lean-to, where it's just three sides and a roof, and that you just kind of orient it away from the wind so that they can get out of the wind and hide from the rain. And that works really well. That's the easiest thing to build. You might even consider a real low-profile one, so something that's just a little bit taller than your tallest mini horse, because it'll help keep the heat in. Unless you live in a really hot climate, then you want to have the roof higher to allow for better ventilation and more air circulation and for the breeze to get in. So a three-sided shelter works perfectly fine. Just make sure it's large enough for all the animals in that pen to get into together, because what you don't want to do is have a mini horse that gets pushed out of the shelter because there's not enough room for three and you have three and you only built a shelter big enough for two. So make sure the shelter is big enough for everyone to fit comfortably, so nobody gets pushed out. Make sure you have plenty of ventilation. In a three-sided shelter, that's fine. Ventilation's easy. You only have three walls. But if you have something like we're using this barn, this is actually a shed that we converted into a barn. It was here on the property when we moved here. And it didn't have great ventilation, so we actually cut vents underneath the eaves. Okay, so we have vents cut under the eaves on either side. We have ventilation on the back here, and the doors are open most of the time to allow for proper ventilation, because what you don't want to do is give your horse a respiratory infection because you trap them in the damp. Okay, you don't want that. Okay, you don't want them to be trapped in the damp. You need them to be dry, and if you trap them so that they can't get out of the... Thank you, Sauron. If you trap them inside a building without great ventilation, you can end up with respiratory distress, and you don't want that. Just think of it, if you're trapped in a humid building, it's not fun. Okay, you want to get out of that humidity. So you do want to make sure you have air circulation. You might have windows that open across from each other to encourage ventilation. Whatever you have, thank you. Whatever you have, you just want to make sure that air circulation is really, really adequate. You want to not have a breeze on your animals, but you do want the air to move. So vents that are up high, like we have under the eaves here, vents that are up high help move that air around without, thank you, buddy, without putting a breeze directly onto your animals, because you don't want them to have that breeze, but you do want them to have ventilation. So just make sure there's a lot of air movement in whatever shelter you have. Also, think about how you're going to orient your shelter. So this shelter was already oriented this way when we came here, and this is actually correct, because we live in a really windy area, but we have the shelter of all these trees, so we don't get a lot of wind. Thank you. We don't get a lot of wind coming from that side, and we don't get a lot of wind coming from this side. We do get a lot of winds coming off this way, because this is the open side of our property, and occasionally we can get kind of wind tunnely and come from this side. So because we have winds from this side and occasionally that side, the door to this shed is facing that way. So it's really protected from the wind. You definitely want to protect your animals from the wind. So the open side of your shelter, so whether you have a lean-to or a shed, wherever the open side is, the door, you want to make sure that that is facing away from wherever the wind comes from. Because you don't want your prevailing winds to be whistling inside your shelter. And you definitely don't want rain to be whistling inside your shelter. You want everyone to stay dry. So definitely consider the placement of your shelter when you're putting them up, just because you want to make sure that nobody... Thank you, Sauron. That's Sauron. But you just want to make sure that nobody gets wet and everyone can stay out of the wind. A final little word on buildings. You notice we have a wooden building. I do recommend wood. Some people use those tin sheds, and that's fine. But the problem is tin is really, really soft. And here's the problem. These little feet are wicked. So if you have tin instead of wood, and your pony puts his foot through that tin, he could slice his foot up. Because if he kicks that tin hard enough, his foot's going through it. Because these are sharp little feet. So if the pony's foot goes through that tin, he could cut himself up, leading to injury or even a fatality, because there's some real big arteries in the feet. So if you have a tin shed, I really recommend... Thank you. So if you have a tin shed, I absolutely recommend putting kind of a wooden kick plate, so getting yourself some plywood and doing like a wood panel up to the height where your pony can kick, just so he can't put his feet through the tin, especially if he's inside the shelter and he's kind of acting up and being a little bit ornery, which, let's face it, mini horses have attitude. They can be ornery. So I would definitely make sure you have some kind of kick plate along the bottom of the wall if you have a tin shed, just so he can't put his foot through the tin. It has happened, and unfortunately, ponies have died because they get their leg cut up on the tin. So if you do have a tin shed, you can use it. Just line the areas where there might be some kicking happening with some wood, so that the pony can't kick right through the tin and hurt himself. It's really an important consideration. I've seen it a couple of times where precautions weren't taken, and there's usually a tragic outcome. So just make sure, if you are using a tin shed, wrap it with a kick plate that is made of wood. A nice thick plywood will do, and then you should be fine. There's nothing wrong with using a tin shed as a shelter. Just make sure you properly outfit it to deal with the temper tantruming mini horse, because frankly, they do have temper tantrums. So if you have a tantruming mini horse, you do want to make sure that they are safe. Anyway, that is about it for us here today at Andersen Acres. I hope this is a little bit helpful to you. We'll see you tomorrow.